Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The shir is Leiluy Nishmat, Daniella, Shaina, Aleho, Hashalom, Bas Yehoshua, Malik, Yichya, Nishama should have an aliyah. This is a series on Dovid Hamelech, and this week we are going to learn about the very first woman, the very first wife that Dovid Hamelech ever marries. The story, of course, is that David has slain Goliath. That Dovid has killed Goliath. Goliath, who terrorized the Jewish nation for 40 days on the battle lines, and insisted that they send one representative to face him and to defeat him. And the volunteer who would face Goliath would determine the fate of the Jewish people. Goliath, the mighty warrior that everybody, including Shaul Hamelech himself, was afraid to face, is smitten down and destroyed by Dovid Hamelech. But you see, there's a catch, because when Shaul was looking for a representative, and he was looking for somebody to face Goliath and beat him, Shaul made two pledges to the one who would be willing to go and face the mighty Goliath. Shaul, the king, promised that any Jew who would go out and be victorious in battle against Goliath would, number one, win the king's daughter's, the king's very daughter's hand in marriage, and number two, the king would make him wealthy. When Dovid is the one who goes out and is victorious over Goliath, Shaul immediately becomes jealous of him. And no mention is made in the Torah of Shaul ever making good on his pledge to allow his daughter to marry Dovid and to bless him with this wealth. In fact, although today we're going to learn about the fact that Shaul does eventually give his daughter to Dovid in marriage, we never find anywhere that Shaul gave the money that he had promised. The daughter, yes, the money not. But even the daughter that Shaul did give Dovid, even this happens only through complications. You see, because Shaul becomes jealous and Shaul becomes angry, and as we learned last week, while Dovid is playing music for him, Shaul is already throwing his spear and trying to kill him. Then the Torah says, if you have a Novi in front of you, Shmuel Aleph Perek Yud Ches, around Pasuk Yud Zayin. Shaul approaches Dovid and says, listen, Dovid, we had a deal that anybody who would slay Goliath will get my daughter's hand in marriage. I have an older daughter. Her name is Meirav, or pronounced Meirav. I'm happy to give her to you as a daughter. The only prerequisite, the only condition is that I'd like for you to be a general in my army, to fight against the Plishtim. The Torah rushes to tell us that at this stage, Shaul has absolutely no intention in really acquiring Dovid as a son-in-law. That's not what he wants. What he really wants is he wants Dovid to die on the battlefront, hoping that if he appoints him as a general and puts him in the line of fire, Dovid will eventually fall in the hands of the Plishtim. And Shaul says, Al tehi yodi boy, let my hand not be the one to strike him. Let him be struck down by the Plishtim. It seems, at the literal meaning of the Pesukim, it seems that Dovid refuses to marry Meirav. It seems that Dovid refuses to take Shaul's older daughter Meirav's hand in marriage. He excuses himself by saying, Mi anoichi, who am I? I'm too insignificant. My family is too insignificant. I should be a son-in-law of the king. No, thank you, says Dovid. However, the Pasuk says, when it came time for Meirav to marry Shaul, for Meirav, the daughter of Shaul, to marry Dovid, she ends up marrying someone else, a man by the name of Adriel. Who this man Adriel is not for tonight. Meirav ends up marrying somebody else. And immediately the Torah says that Shaul has another daughter. And the second daughter's name is Michal, or Michal. And Michal, the Torah says, is deeply in love with Dovid. And she informs her father that she'd like to marry Dovid. Shaul's idea was that the older daughter Meirav would marry Dovid. That apparently never works out. Instead, it's Shaul's younger daughter Michal who tells her father that she'd like to marry Dovid, and Shaul is pleased with this. And Shaul once again sets into motion a plan in which he'd give his daughter Michal's hand to Dovid in marriage, but in such a way that it would end up hurting Dovid and not helping him. What happens is Shaul anticipates that if he approaches Dovid directly and tells him, my younger daughter Michal would like to marry you, that Dovid is going to give him the same shtick. He's going to say, look, who am I to be the son-in-law of the king, etc. Shaul wants this marriage to happen again, not because he wants Dovid as a son-in-law, but because he's hoping to use it as a tool to put Dovid in harm's way. So Shaul secretly has his servants go and talk to Dovid and whisper in his ear and tell Dovid that he dare not turn down this offer. After all, who would refuse the king's daughter's hand in marriage? And Shaul has his men talk to Dovid in secret and in private and try to convince him to take Michal's hand in marriage. Dovid Hamelech, who is not yet Dovid Hamelech at this stage, tells the people in confidence that he's concerned that he doesn't have any money. He doesn't have money for a dowry. He can't afford to get married at this stage. He doesn't have with what to support a wife. And this message is repeated back to Shaul. Dovid is concerned that he doesn't have the means to lead a married life. So Shaul makes a very, very strange stipulation. He has a message sent back to Dovid that Dovid need not bring a penny in order to get married. Rather, all the king requests is, quote, Meya Orlois. Meya Orlois Plishtim. Meya Orlois Plishtim means 100 foreskins of the of male Plishtim. It was basically Shaul's way of saying to Dovid, in order to win my daughter's hand, you have to go out and kill 100 Plishtim, bring me their foreskins, and you can marry Michal. So Dovid gathers a small army and he goes out and he initiates a small war against the Plishtim. He brings back 200 foreskins of the Plishtim, 200 Plishti foreskins, which the understanding is he'd never be able to take those from the Plishtim if they were alive, so he's got to kill them. And he wins Michal, the daughter of the king's hand, in marriage, and they get married. Now, before I go on, Michal and Dovid have a long, complicated marriage. What happens later on is that Shaul hunts Dovid. He wants to kill him. At one stage, Michal and Dovid realize that Shaul's men are coming to kill Dovid. So Michal has Dovid climb out the window, her own husband. She has her own husband climb out the window and escape and run away. She puts pillows and blankets. She puts pillows under the blankets of his bed. And when she opens the door for her father Shaul's men, she tells them that her husband Dovid is ill and cannot be taken out of bed. And she shows them a mound of apparently a sleeping man lying under the covers. And she tells them, here's my husband, he doesn't feel well. Please leave him alone. The men go back to Shaul and they tell Shaul that Michal is telling them that Dovid is sick and he's lying under the covers. And Shaul doesn't really believe the story and he says, go back and bring me Dovid as he's lying in his bed. I need to see him and speak to him. They go back to his home to retrieve him, and of course it is at that point that they discover that they've been duped by Michal, the king's own daughter. They've been duped by her. And in the meanwhile, Dovid has had enough time to flee and to run away. They bring Michal back to the king, back to Shaul, and Shaul says to her, what have you done? You've taken your husband's side against me. I'm your father, I'm your flesh and blood. Why would you help your husband escape from me? Why would you take his side and not mine? And Michal tells her father, I had no choice. My husband Dovid forced me. He threatened me. I had to do it. And again, in the meanwhile, Dovid is once again able to escape from Shaul and his wrath. When Dovid fled, Shaul gave his daughter Michal to another man in marriage. The other man's name was Palti, or in some places in Torah, he's called Paltiel. Halachically, Michal was still married to Dovid Hamelech, and so she was not allowed to get married to Palti. And the Gemara describes in great detail how Michal and Palti never engaged in intimate relations because she, Michal, was actually still halachically married and legally the wife of Dovid. And so, although for all appearances, Shaul had forced his daughter Michal to marry someone else, they never actually got married and they never lived together as husband and wife. It remained this way until after the death of Shaul. After Shaul eventually passed, Dovid summonses his wife Michal, the first woman that he really ever married, summonses him back, where she remains with him until the end of their lives. The other story the Torah tells us about Michal, the daughter of Shaul, is that the wife of Dovid, is that she once rebuked Dovid. This story of Michal's rebuke of Dovid takes place when Dovid one day finally is able to bring back the Oren of the Oren of Hashem, the Oren that would one day sit in the Beis HaMikdash. He's able to bring it back to Yerushalayim. And the Torah describes the celebration as they brought this Oren Elokim back to Yerushalayim, the singing, the dancing, the celebration, and how Dovid Hamelech himself was celebrating and dancing with all of his strength, mefazez u'mecharker b'chol oiz, in the presence of Hashem. And his wife, Michal, his first wife, Shaul had other wives, but his first wife, Michal, saw through the window the way Dovid was dancing in the presence of the Oren, and she wasn't impressed. She felt that her husband was debasing himself, was acting in a way that wasn't befitting for a king. So she followed the custom of Jewish women, and when her husband came home that night, she told him exactly what she thought about his conduct that day. And she told him, "You are a king. You cannot act this way in the presence of the people." Dovid is not impressed with Michal's rebuke. He takes that opportunity to remind her that it was in him, it was in Dovid that Hashem had chosen and his children, and not in Shaul, not Michal's father and his children. And the Torah says that as a punishment, Michal never had children with Dovid until the day she died. I should point out that there is an argument among the commentaries what that means. Does that mean that Michal Bas Shaul never had any children with Dovid, ever? And she died childless? Or does it mean that she never had any children until the day she died, but the day she died, she did have a child, and according to this opinion, she died in childbirth? Either way, the continuation of David's kingdom is not through the child that he has with Michal, even according to the opinion that he does have a child with Michal. It's important to understand what is really at. Oh God, I'm going to turn off the air conditioner. It's important to understand what really is at stake here when we talk about whether or not Dovid has children from his wife, who is the daughter of Shaul Hamelech. You see, Hashem took the Melucha, Hashem took royalty away from King Shaul and gave it to Dovid Hamelech for all sorts of reasons. But Dovid married one of Shaul's daughters. Dovid was destined to have come from him kings, future leaders of the Jewish people, Shlomo Hamelech, etc., who would be the future monarchs of the Jews. It was not specifically decreed which wife, which woman would be the mother of these future kings of the Jewish people. It was specifically decreed that they would be descendants of Dovid, but it wasn't specifically decreed which wife of Dovid would bear these children for him. And it was almost like this could have been another chance for the bloodline, for the future monarchs, for the future kings of the Jewish people to still come from Shaul Hamelech, because Shaul Hamelech was prepared to give his own daughter's hand to Dovid Hamelech, and that could have produced more kings. But alas, even that was not meant to be. And instead, the future monarch and king comes not from Dovid and one of Shaul's daughters, but rather it comes from Dovid and a woman we'll learn about in Mitzvah Shem over the next couple of weeks, Bathsheba, who is someone else altogether. She's the one who mothers Shlomo Hamelech. So not only does it not come from any of Shaul's sons, but in the end, it doesn't even come from any, the bloodline does not even come from any of Shaul's daughters. The Gemara has a very interesting discussion here with regard to these two daughters of Shaul, the older one, Meirav, and the younger one, Michal. You see, the Torah, the exact wording of the pasuk, is not 100% clear as to what exactly happened with Meirav. The wording in the pasuk is, "Vayehi be'eis teis es Meirav b'Shaul Dovid." At the time of the giving of the daughter of Meirav, the daughter of Shaul, to Dovid, and she was given to someone else by the name of Adriel. Well, the Gemara says, what does this mean? Does this mean that Meirav was not given to Dovid, instead she was given to Adriel? Or does it mean that she was given to Dovid and then later given to Adriel? Which one is it? Did Meirav marry Dovid or not? This is an argument in the Talmud, among the commentaries and in the Talmud. Some say no, it means she wasn't given to Dovid. Others say no, it means she was given to Dovid and he did marry her, or at least tried to marry her. Of course, Dovid would never have been able to be married to both Meirav and Michal at the same time, because Meirav and Michal were sisters, and it's considered one of the arayas, it's considered one of the forbidden incestual relationships in the Torah for a man to be married to a woman and her sister. Even if you divorce one woman, it is biblically forbidden to marry her sister as long as the original woman is alive. So Dovid, of course, could never have been married to both. But some opinions say he married Meirav. And when the Torah says that he married Michal, that was only after Meirav had already passed on. Other opinions say no, he never married Meirav in the first place. And the Gemara explains it this way. The Gemara says it wasn't that he didn't try. It wasn't that he didn't intend. It wasn't that Shaul didn't intend. Everybody intended for Meirav and Shaul to get married. But alas, their marriage was never meant to be. I'll tell you what happened. This is the way the Gemara explains it. The Gemara says there's three ways for a man to make a woman his wife. Bekesef, through money; bishtar, through a document; or bebia, or through intimate relations. The custom, the way we do it, and this is the way it's done at every chuppah and every Jewish marriage, is that we make the kiddushin, we make the marriage through kesef. So the man will stand with a woman under the chuppah, and he'll give her a ring, right? Usually the ring is made out of gold, but he'll give her something to a degree of significant value, and he'll place the ring on her finger, and he'll say to her, Hareyat mekudeshesli, you are hereby betrothed to me with this ring, with this value, with this money, in accordance with the law of Moshe and Yisrael. Now the Torah tells us Dovid had no money. Well, he did have money, but the money that he had was designated, as we learned, to build the Beis HaMikdash. And he didn't want to use any of that to do the kiddushin, to do the marriage between himself and Meirav. So what did he do? Under the chuppah, in the presence of two kosher witnesses, and whichever rov it was, that was his lucky day to do the king's daughter's wedding, Dovid turned to Meirav and said, my dear future wife, your father owes me a tremendous amount of money. Your father, Shaul Hamelech, promised that whoever will smite Goliath, that he, Shaul, will make them rich. And I haven't gotten a penny of the money yet. So you know something, says Dovid? I hereby betroth you with the money, not with a ring, but with the money that your father owes me for killing Goliath. With that loan, with that debt that I have against your father, I give that to you, and with this, I am Makadesh you. With this, I create the Kiddushin. The Gemara calls this Hamakadesh B'milveh. Hamakadesh B'milveh means one who tries to marry a woman, but instead of giving her money, gives her a loan. The Gemara says, what if a woman lends a man money? Other way around. What if a man lends a woman money, lends her $1,000, and then they fall in love and they want to get married? And when it comes time to get married, the man says to her, you know what? Instead of giving you a ring, or instead of giving you money or kesef or value with which to create the kiddushin, I'll tell you what, I'm going to write off the loan. I lent you $1,000 a month ago, 3 months ago. You can keep it. And with that $1,000, I'd like to enact the kiddushin. It's called a makadesh b'milva, one who tries to create kiddushin through a loan. The Gemara says, a makadesh b'milva eino mekudeshes. If you seek to betroth a woman with money that is owed to you as a loan, in debt, she is not mukadeshes, she's not betrothed to you. Why not? Says the Gemara, milva lo hitzon nitna, when you lend someone money, the money is lent with the intention of it being spent by the borrower. The borrower borrows it to use it, and the lender lends the money with the intent that the borrower will use it and spend it. And once the money has been spent, it no longer exists. So you cannot come to a woman and say, I'm marrying you, I'm betrothing you, I'm going to give you kiddushin with money that you, the woman, owe me, the man. I'm writing off the loan, and here it is for you. You're now my wife. Says the Gemara, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Why not? Because you're not giving her anything. The loan that you gave her a while ago has already been spent. The money that you gave her a while ago is already gone. And now all you're giving her is providing her a release of the obligation to return the money. And that's not tangible funds. And with that kiddushin, with that marriage cannot be created. And so this, says the Gemara, is what happens with Shaul and Meirav. With Dovid and Meirav. Dovid wants to marry Meirav, but he doesn't want to use the money that he's collected. He's collected a fortune. He doesn't want to use that money because that money is designated for the Beis HaMikdash. And so Dovid says to Meirav, 1 second, I'm a wealthy man. Your father Shaul owes me so much money. I'll tell you what, says Dovid, I'll write off the debt. As far as I'm concerned, you and your father don't have to give me anything. You can keep it. And with this, I will make you my wife. And his kiddushin were invalid. David's kiddushin were invalid. And because of that, Meir, at least according to this opinion, Meirav was not really his wife. And that's why she was given to someone else in marriage. And Dovid ends up marrying Michal, the woman who deeply loves him. I once heard a beautiful explanation as to why we say that a makadesh b'milva eino mekudeshes, or if one seeks to betroth a woman with a loan, she's not married. After all, it's difficult to understand, right? If you've ever been to a wedding, you may have heard that before the kiddushin is done, before the man puts the ring on the woman's finger, the Rav will show the ring to the two witnesses and ask them, is this worth a shava pruta? Is this worth, a shava pruta is approximately a nickel. And if it's worth approximately a nickel, then it's sufficient to marry a woman. Doesn't particularly cost, in Jewish law, doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money in order to create a kiddush, in order to create a marriage. 1 pruta is sufficient. So here you have a man who is prepared to write off a debt of $1,000, $10,000, $100,000. Doesn't matter how big the loan is. He's prepared to write off. What if the man has $1 million debt against the woman, and he's prepared to write off the whole thing? And he says to her, "Hareyat mekudeshes li, you'll be married to me, and for this kiddushin, I'll write off the entire loan." She's not his wife. But if he gives her 1 pruta, if he gives her 1 penny, then she is. In this case, Dovid Hamelech was owed a fortune of money. The very king of Israel promised wealth to the man who would slay Goliath and save the Jewish people. And Dovid was prepared to write the whole thing off. And he did. And he wanted an exchange to create kiddushin between him and Meirav. We say it doesn't work. Hamakadesh b'milva eino mekudeshes. And had he given her even 1 pruta, had he given her even something of the smallest of value, of the most even seemingly insignificant, all barely significant amount of money, the Kiddushin would have worked. Why? Why is it that you cannot create Kiddushin with a loan, no matter how big it is? You can only create it through giving something of value, no matter how small it is. I once read a beautiful insight on this, and the rabbis explained, Kiddushin, the word Kiddushin, in context, means marriage. When a man marries a woman, the halachic term for it is Kiddushin. But the actual translation of the word Kiddushin is sanctity, is holiness. The Gemara, in fact, even asks, why are we calling marriage Kiddushin? Kiddushin means something which belongs in the Beis HaMikdash. Why are we calling marriage between a husband and a wife? Why are we calling it Kiddushin? The Gemara says, because when a man marries a woman, they become exclusively connected to each other to the exclusion of everybody else. They're forbidden to everybody. The woman is forbidden to everyone else, kehektish, like something that belongs to the Beis HaMikdash. But of course, the meaning of it is that this is something which is holy. God's presence, Hashem's presence, will please God rest in this relationship. And for this reason, we call it Kiddushin. And here the Torah teaches us perhaps the most important lesson, or the most important ingredient in creating Kiddushin, in creating holiness. And that is, you cannot create holiness unless you're working with something real and tangible. If you're writing off a debt, no matter how big that debt is, no matter how much it's worth, if it isn't tangible, and if it isn't real, and if it isn't concrete, and if it isn't here and now, you cannot create Kedusha through this. You see, what the Gemara is really saying is, if a man seeks to create Kiddushin, if a man seeks to create a marriage with a woman by writing off a loan, what we really say to him is, you can't do that. You know why? Because the money that you're talking about, you gave her a long time ago. And the money that you gave her a long time ago is not powerful enough, it's not valuable enough, it's not in existence in order for you to marry her now. You want to marry her now? Give her something now, and then you can create Kiddushin. It's the first lesson when it comes to creating any type of holiness in our lives, and that is, one has to be able to not look at the past. It doesn't matter what happened until now. It doesn't matter if yesterday I had tremendous success or even, God forbid, tremendous failure. It doesn't matter. What matters is what happens now. And now you need to be able to do something which produces Kedusha and which is powerful. Recently, I heard that a man once came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe at the age of 50. He was having a midlife crisis. Midlife crisis. You should never know from such things. Usually, the only solution to a midlife crisis is to buy a Jag. What else are you going to do? He was having a midlife crisis at the age of 50, and he came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and he said, Rebbe, I'm 50. There's so much in my life that I was hoping to accomplish that I never did. It's making me depressed. And the Rebbe said, oh, no, you don't. Don't look back. Don't look at what happened until now. It's not important. If you're here, and if you're around, and if Hashem has given you abilities, it's time to begin. And then the Rebbe said to him, how old do you think Moshe Rabbeinu was when Hashem tapped him on the shoulder one day and said, you're going to be the leader of the Jewish people. Take them out of Mitzrayim. Give them the Torah. Take them across the desert. Bring them into the promised land. Be the final redeemer of the Jews. How old was Moshe Rabbeinu? He was 80 years old. He could have said, dear God, I'm 80 years old. I've had an accomplished career. Moshe was a king of the land of Midian for 40 years. Find someone younger. Find someone ambitious. Find someone hungry. Find someone who hasn't accomplished anything in their life. I'm already old. I'm 80. Had Moshe Rabbeinu said that, who knows if he would have become Moshe Rabbeinu. Instead, Hashem said, now is your moment and now is your time. Go ahead, go to the Yidden, redeem them, take them out of Mitzrayim and take them to the promised land. Hamakadosh b'milveh on a spiritual level means one who seeks to create holiness based on their past, based on what it is that they experienced and they did, based on contributions they made previously, even if they're willing to forego the return on what it is that they invested beforehand. The Torah tells us, Eina mekudeshes, no kedushin is created through something that you've done in the past. It doesn't work that way. If you want to create kedusha, you have to start now. You see, perhaps it can be argued that this is one of the differences between Shaul Hamelech and Dovid Hamelech. Shaul and Dovid both had very troubled pasts. They both had skeletons in their closets. They both had issues. Shaul was supposed to defeat Malik. He didn't do exactly as he was supposed to, and because of that, he lost the kingdom. Dovid was suspected by his brothers and his father as a mamzer. He was excommunicated from his family. He was forced to tend to the sheep all day. Nobody took him seriously for the first 30 years of his life. It seems that more than anything, what plagued Shaul HaMelech was his past. What plagued Shaul, what he couldn't get over, was his past. Shaul said, how can I, a man who was king over Israel and the first king of Israel yesterday, be replaced by some young schnook that comes out of nowhere after what I did, after what I've been through, after what I achieved, what I accomplished, after my tzidkas? How can it all be taken away from me in a moment? It seems that that's what really plagues Shaul, and he can't get past it. Even Dovid's greatness, even Dovid's rise to fame is launched off the back of Shaul HaMelech. It was Shaul HaMelech's war that creates the platform for Dovid to rise to success and fame. It was on Shaul HaMelech's watch that an opportunity presents itself that Dovid takes that makes him so beloved by the Jews. And King Shaul is sitting there and saying, how did this happen? How did I go yesterday from being the greatest Jew, the king of Israel, to today being possessed by an evil spirit? He couldn't make peace with it. He was stuck in the past. And Hashem said, nothing good comes from that today. It's not that the past is not important. Of course the past is important. But the past is only important if it has some tangible, significant impact on today. And if today all you show up with is a story, all you show up with is a loan, but you're not giving anything concrete, Eino Mekudeshes, it creates no Kedusha. Dovid HaMelech, on the other hand, was able to shake off his past. And despite being suspected of being a mamzer, and despite all of the many challenges that we'll learn about and are learning and will continue to learn, despite everything Dovid goes through, somehow he never lets his past define him. He's able to move forward. Shaul sinned, the Gemara says, and got stuck in it. Dovid sinned and didn't. Dovid is able every day to reinvent and to start again. And even later on, we'll learn, as Dovid faces tremendous tragedy, Rahman al-Islam, in his lifetime, Dovid buries 4 of his own children. One of his children rebel against him. Later we'll learn, Dovid is almost killed by one of his own children, forced into exile. While he's being forced into exile, he's ridiculed and humiliated and almost stoned to death. And yet Dovid escapes with his life for one more day, where instead of being resentful about the past, he thanks Hashem and looks forward to the future. You see, the fact that Dovid doesn't manage to achieve a marriage with Meirav, with the older daughter of Shaul. Meirav, Shaul's older daughter, represents Shaul's strength. He used Shaul's method to try to create this bond with Meirav, and it doesn't work. And Dovid says, aha, I cannot create a kiddushin, I cannot create a lasting marriage with a woman through something that I've achieved in the past. I have to do it now. And even if all Dovid is prepared to give is a bunch of foreskins from Plishtim, you'll excuse me, the Gemara asks, how much was it even worth? How much were these foreskins even worth? They were barely worth anything. Shaul Hamelech looked at them and said, they're actually not worth anything. But apparently they were worth one pruta. And Dovid says, if I can do this today, then I can marry the daughter of the king and go out to war tomorrow and do what it is that I have to do. I think it's one of the most important lessons in terms of Jewish leadership. You see, a Jewish leader has to know the past. A Jewish leader has to know the stories of the Jewish people from previous generations and previous times. A wise man once said, those who don't know history will repeat its mistakes. A Jewish leader has to know where it is that we came from and what it is that happened before now. But a Jewish leader can never get stuck there, because whatever it was that happened yesterday needs to be reinvented and redefined and brought back into a changing world and be reinvented to a changing people, to different times and different circumstances. I think one can safely say that Dovid learns this from Shaul and learns not to repeat his mistakes. And this perhaps makes him qualified to be king. It wasn't that Dovid didn't suffer personal loss. It wasn't that Dovid made no mistakes. It wasn't that Dovid didn't have his own challenges with Hashem. It was that no matter what happens, he's able to stand up and brush himself off and move on. There's an old Hasidic analogy. That says, a man once wanted to sell a chicken. He had a chicken. He wanted to sell it. He took a look at the chicken and he sees the chicken is very dirty, filthy. I can't sell the chicken when it looks so dirty. Nobody's going to want to buy it. So he starts to clean it. And he starts to brush the feathers of the chicken. But as he reaches for the chicken, keeps running away and he keeps chasing it. And the chicken keeps running further and he's getting exhausted. Eventually he gives up and he stomps his foot in the ground and goes, I give up. And the chicken gets scared from the stomp. It flaps its own wings. And in 2 seconds, the chicken is clean. And that's an old Hasidic analogy, and the Hasidim would say, sometimes with one flap of the wings, you can discard all the dirt that's been sitting there, that's been accumulated there for so long, that nobody else could take off of you. What Shaul Hamelech needed to do, what Shaul Hamelech apparently couldn't do, he couldn't shake his own past. He couldn't shake his greatness. He couldn't shake his fall. He felt he had fallen so terribly, he couldn't get back up. The impact was too powerful for him. And Dovid Hamelech seems to have this ability of always being able to get up again and again, even as Shaul tries to kill him once and twice and 3 times, and even as Shaul disappoints him and doesn't make good on the pledges that he promised to Dovid. And even as all of Shaul's ministers and advisors are out to get him and accusing him of not being a kosher Jew, somehow Dovid is always able to look forward to a brighter tomorrow. This is one of the qualities that distinguished him from Shaul Hamelech, that made his melucha a lasting melucha, whereas Shaul's was not. All right. Have a wonderful Shabbos. With Hashem's help and Mitzvah Hashem, we'll continue next week.